The year is 1220. The greatest Islamic power of the East, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, is rapidly crumbling into dust. The empire of the Khwarazm Shahs, which had fielded a colossal military machine, a force exceeding the might of any European monarch of that era many times over, is vanishing from the map of the world in a matter of months. Many believed that this flourishing land of science and commerce was crushed by the steel cavalry of Genghis Khan. It is customary to view the invasion of the nomads as a natural disaster, sweeping away everything in its path. However, the yellowed pages of Persian chronicles preserve a different, terrifying truth. The Shaker of the universe did not kill Khwarazm. By the time the hooves of Mongol horses touched the waters of the Sir Darya, the empire already resembled a living corpse. Its spine was not broken by accurate arrows. The superpower was cold-bloodedly strangled by one single woman. Look beyond the burning metropolises of Central Asia. Forget about the horizons blackened by countless enemy banners. We are transporting ourselves into the very heart of a doomed country. Gurganj, a capital drowning in silks, fragrant with spices and ringing with gold. Here, in cool chambers sheltered from the steppe heat, sits an elderly ruler, a Kipchak princess whose slightest movement of the eyebrows weighs more than the official decrees of the Sultan. While her son, the master of half the world, Muhammad II, rushes about the continent in terror, trying to hide from the dogs of war, Jabe and Subutai, this woman firmly grips the threads of control over a collapsing world. Her name is Terken Khatun, the shadow ruler of Khwarazm. Previously, we analyzed how the greed of Governor Inalchuq drowned Otrar in blood, provoking the catastrophe. We watched as fear robbed Muhammad of his reason, forcing him to abandon his army and perish in poverty on an island. Today, we will expose the true root of this tragedy. It is time to descend into the labyrinth of palace intrigues to find out who exactly built a system where cowardice and corruption became the only methods of survival. You will see how maternal guardianship transforms into a suffocating dictatorship. You will understand why a thirst for personal control forced a woman to paralyze her own troops, literally opening the gates to the invaders. Before you will unfold the psychological drama of a matriarch ready to burn her own kingdom down, just so she wouldn't have to share power with a hated grandson. This is a story about how egoism of elites strikes more painfully than any foreign sword. You will trace how blinding pride turned into collapse, and how the mistress who dictated her will to emirs ended her days in stocks, weeping for the amusement of enemies. What word spoken by her at the decisive moment crossed out the lives of millions and erased Khwarazm from history? The vanity of rulers often costs nations far too dearly. You are watching Chronicles of the Great, the series God's Anger, Episode 3, Terken Khatun, Anatomy of an Authoritarian Suicide. The beginning of the 13th century. The empire of the Khwarazm Shahs is spread out like a colossal monolith from the harsh shores of the Caspian to the sweltering Persian Gulf. Before us is not just a state. This giant superpower has swallowed the territories of modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Sultan Muhammad II, intoxicated by recent triumphs over the Karakhanids and Ghurids, openly demands to be styled the Second Iskander, a new Alexander the Great. His regular army numbers a fantastic figure, 400,000 sabers. To realize the true scale, This military machine exceeded the population of Paris and London of that era, combined in sheer numbers. The capital of the empire is boiling with life. Masters forge the best steel, weavers create the finest silk, and in libraries, priceless scientific treatises are being copied. But behind the backs of the palace guard, in the very heart of civilization, a political schizophrenia is ripening, corroding the empire from within. Two courts coexist in the state, two centers of decision-making. Behind the carved doors of the Sultan's chambers, Muhammad dictates his will, sends legions on distant campaigns, and receives foreign ambassadors. However, as soon as a courier carries the decree outside the throne room, the paper instantly loses its power. Any state document, death sentence, or personnel appointment is required to pass through a double approval. Look at the heavy golden seal, descending with a dull thud onto the parchment over the Sultan's tugra. Carved upon it is an indisputable inscription: Protectress of the world and faith, the great Terken, mistress of women of both worlds. Terken Khatun, the mother of the reigning monarch, is not simply a shadow behind her son's back. She has erected a parallel vertical of power. Under her command functioned a personal divan, devoted viziers served her, and she collected taxes from colossal land holdings. But most importantly, this strong-willed woman held the entire military elite of Khwarazm in a steel fist. The motives for this cruelty were rooted in the deep past. What drove the Snake Queen? The answer lies in a basic survival instinct. Terken Khatun came from the nomadic Kongli tribe, a powerful branch of the Kipchaks. Finding herself in the refined, thoroughly Persian environment of Khwarazm, the stepped aristocrat felt like an outsider. Iranian officials and the local clergy openly despised her Kipchak kin. To preserve her position in this aggressive environment, Terken Khatun bet on brute force. She drew tens of thousands of her tribesmen to the capital, distributing the highest army posts among them. Sultan Muhammad, who was trying to build a centralized state on the Persian model, became a hostage of his own guard. The warlords ignored the monarch's orders, submitting exclusively to the gesture of his mother. Terken Khatun believed she was constructing an indestructible shield for her dynasty. By placing loyal chieftains in key positions, she hoped their blades would cement the foundation of the throne. In reality, the matriarch nurtured an ungovernable army of mercenaries that turned into a caste of untouchables. Officers looted the population and terrorized cities, knowing the Queen Mother would shelter them from any anger of the Sultan. The irony of this strategy became fatal. While trying to ensure the empire against internal rebellions, Terken Khatun destroyed the chain of command and paralyzed the country in the face of a looming external threat. The power turned into a colossus whose legs were marching in opposite directions. The power of the Snake Queen reached the absolute, but this might had its own dark price. To maintain the loyalty of the wild Kipchak generals, Terken Khatun had to forgive them any cruelty. She covered her attack dogs with an impenetrable dome of state protection. She did not yet guess that soon one of her favorites would cross an invisible line, a fatal deed that would be impossible to hide behind the high walls of the palace. This action would awaken a sleeping dragon in the east. The countdown to the end. The year is 1218. Otrar, a trading metropolis on the eastern frontier of the empire, washed in blood. We have already touched upon the tragedy of the death of Genghis Khan's 450 merchants, but today we will look behind the scenes of this slaughter. Let us pass through the smoke of the ashes straight into the corridors of the Khwarazmian court. Why did an ordinary governor of a border province decide on such madness? The answer lies not in greed, but in lineage. Inalchuq Khan belonged to the highest nobility. He was a relative of Terken Khatun herself. Kinship with the Snake Queen gave him absolute immunity. Watching the caravans from the fortress walls, he saw not a neighbor's ambassadors, but easy prey. Khan looted and killed, knowing his influential aunt in the capital would cover up any sin. A surviving witness of the massacre brings the news to the steppe. Genghis Khan, contrary to his reputation as a furious barbarian, displays pragmatism. The Lord of the East sends a diplomatic mission with a clear demand: hand over the culprit for trial. The death of one official in exchange for peace for millions. Let us transport ourselves to the semi-darkness of the throne room in Gurganj. Before Muhammad II stand the envoys of the nomads, voicing a harsh ultimatum. Behind the monarch's back, the Kipchak generals have frozen like an invisible wall. Their gazes do not express submissiveness, they are waiting for action. The ruler, who fancied himself the second Iskander, was caught in a deadly vice. On one side, the terrifying might of the Mongol army; on the other, paralyzing fear of his own mother. To hand over Khan meant an open conflict with the Snake Queen. 400,000 Kipchak mercenaries would have considered the extradition of a tribesman as a betrayal. It is as if a modern president could not arrest a criminal governor, because behind him stand the entire armed forces of the country, ready for immediate military mutiny. Muhammad felt the noose of maternal influence tightening around his neck. Trying to appease the Kipchak elite, he makes a fatal mistake. The execution of the ambassadors was supposed to show his iron grip, but in reality, it only proved his helplessness. Attempting to avoid a palace coup, the Sultan single-handedly signed the mandate for the destruction of his state. The bloodied head of the chief ambassador falls onto the stone slabs. The executioners singe the beards of the surviving diplomats, throwing them out the gates. The die was cast. This barbarous gesture erases the last chances for peace. The Monder killing machine of Genghis Khan has been set in motion, and it is impossible to stop it. It would seem that in the face of the apocalypse, the nation should clench into a single fist. However, the truth is paradoxical. Terken Khatun's main enemy was not in the Mongol steppes at all. This man lived in her own palace, provoking burning hatred by the very fact of his existence, and for the sake of his fall, the Snake Queen would prefer to burn Khwarazm to the ground. Autumn of the year 1219, the earth of Central Asia shudders under the measured tread of a steel avalanche. 150,000 of Genghis Khan's horsemen cross the borders of the Khwarazmian Empire. Against them, the empire fields a colossal power. This giant army, surpassing the forces of most European monarchs, could have easily crushed the invaders in one general battle. The state needed only to clench itself into a single fist. In the military council convened under the vaults of Sultan Muhammad II's tent, passions are boiling. Before the ruler stands his eldest son, Crown Prince Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. A fearless youth, possessing a brilliant tactical instinct, begs his father to give battle. He is eager to personally lead the vanguard, pull the scattered regiments to the banks of the Sir Darya, and throw the nomads into the water before they have time to deploy. The prince's logic sounds flawless. Military science dictates an immediate offensive. But from the semi-darkness of the palace corridors steps an invisible yet insurmountable force. The Snake Queen makes her move. Terken Khatun categorically forbids her son, the Sultan, from transferring the united army under the command of Jalal al-Din? Why did his own grandmother prefer to doom the country to destruction by blocking a plan that would save it? The answer lies in the pathological, destructive egoism of power. Jalal al-Din was born of a Turkmen concubine named Kipchak, and not of a noble Kipchak princess. Because of this low origin, the powerful Terken Khatun flatly refused to recognize him as the heir to the throne. She systematically undermined the rights of her eldest grandson, promoting the interests of her half-brother Uzlag, who was half Kipchak. To the ruler, the talented commander seemed a stranger, despised by her arrogant kin. The matriarch calculated the situation with the cold cynicism of a vulture. If the prince leads the army and smashes the enemy, he will return to the capital a national hero. Covered in glory, Jalal al-Din will immediately remove the corrupt Kipchak clan from administration, whose puppets Terken Khatun had placed in the highest posts. A military triumph would strip her party of any weight. Before the woman stood a monstrous choice: risk the state or forever lose control over the throne. She believed that by scattering the troops across fortresses, she would preserve loyal generals and prevent her hated grandson from rising. Her own fear of her grandson proved more dangerous to her than Mongol arrows. Succumbing to the suffocating pressure of her mother and fearing a mutiny of the warlords, the Sultan commits the irreparable. The Sultan dismembers the invincible army, locking the regiments in the garrisons of Otrar, Bukhara, and Samarkand. The fortress walls, intended to serve as a shield, instantly turn into stone crypts. Genghis Khan, a master of maneuver warfare, did not believe his luck. Instead of a heavy battle with a monolithic force, the invaders began to methodically, like a surgical scalpel, cut out the isolated garrisons one by one. Mongol spies had already reported to their master about the feud between the Shah and his mother, who controlled the elite divisions. The enemy virtuously took advantage of this schism. The machine of destruction began to work at full capacity. Blooming metropolises fall into the abyss, turning into piles of ash. The frightened Sultan abandons his power, fleeing from the implacable dogs of war. The great empire is bursting on the seams. Cities are burning, and in the midst of this man-made apocalypse, the Snake Queen remains completely alone. Soon, that very despised grandson will knock on the doors of her palace, offering a final chance for salvation. The year is 1220. Central Asia is choking on blood, living through the blackest months in its history. The empire of Khwarazm Shahs, which seemed an unshakable colossus, is falling to pieces with terrifying speed. Sultan Muhammad II, finally broken by a primal horror of the inevitable Mongol pursuit, abandons his country. The former master of half the world, who called himself the shadow of Allah on earth, flees to a tiny island in the Caspian Sea, blown by all winds, where he will soon end his days ingloriously from pneumonia in the dirty shirt of a leper. The center of resistance shifts to Gurganj. The luxurious capital of the empire, which had absorbed the riches of the Silk Road for centuries, is now suffocating from panic. Streets that formerly teemed with precious silks and were filled with the aroma of spices are jammed with refugees, and a ringing chaos reigns in the palaces. The nobility feverishly loads valuables, realizing that Mongol tumans are already wiping neighboring provinces off the face of the earth. It is at this critical moment that a figure capable of turning the tide of history steps onto the proscenium. Crown Prince Jalal al-Din, a brilliant tactician and perhaps the only man in the family who has retained his sanity, tries to gather the shards of the broken military machine. The youth understands it is impossible to hold the capital. Immediate evacuation is required to the southern regions not yet touched by the war, or to India, in order to build a new line of defense there, relying on fresh forces. Jalal al-Din performs an act requiring colossal nobility. Forgetting decades of humiliation, contempt, and attempts to deprive him of his lawful throne, the prince, covered in the dust of battle, enters the chambers of his grandmother, Terken Khatun. The young commander, gripping the hilt of a worn saber, offers the all-powerful matriarch salvation. He is ready to take command of the rearguard and cut a path through any ambushes to safely lead the Snake Queen, her entire court, and the younger grandsons to the south. His plan looked like the only pragmatic way to save the dynasty. Behind Jalal al-Din stood the most devoted and desperate fighters, ready to lay down their lives for the heir. She needed only to agree. But Terken Khatun, sitting imperturbably on brocade pillows, measured her grandson with an icy gaze full of contempt. In response to the offered life, she throws a phrase that will forever remain in the chronicles as an epitaph to her own madness. "Begone! Get out!" the ruler mints arrogantly. "I would rather become a captive of Genghis Khan than depend on the mercy of this boy and his slave mother." Let us analyze the internal logic of this monstrous choice. Why does a person standing on the edge of an abyss voluntarily push away the only outstretched hand? The reason lay not in blindness, but in the very nature of absolute power. To agree to her grandson's proposal meant for the proud Kipchak princess to publicly sign off on the collapse of her entire life strategy. It meant admitting that her beloved generals turned out to be cowards, and the despised son of a Turkmen concubine was the only true warrior in the empire. For a woman accustomed to commanding kings, losing face turned out to be more terrible than losing her life. Terken Khatun sincerely believed that her status would create an impenetrable shield for her, even in the enemy camp. She reasoned in categories of the old world. Monarchs may fight, but they do not kill those equal to them in blood. She assumed that Genghis Khan, having captured her, would be forced to show honor to the Dowager Empress, offering a noble alliance or a comfortable exile. She did not understand the main thing. The laws of the old world were no longer in effect. The Lord of the East recognized no aristocratic merits of defeated nations. For the Mongol military machine, the titles of fallen enemies turned into dust under the hooves of horses. Striving to avoid imaginary humiliation from her own grandson, Terken Khatun single-handedly wrote herself a ticket to the hell of the most sophisticated slavery that a crowned person could ever be honored with. Having rejected help, the matriarch does not intend to surrender immediately. Loading decades of camels with the dead weight of gold and a scattering of precious stones, taking with her the entire harem with her favorite younger grandsons, she secretly leaves the doomed Gurganj. The caravan with untold riches rushes south to the mountains of Mazarandan. There, among sharp rocks, rises an impenetrable stronghold, the fortress of Ilal. The citadel promised reliable protection, fed from colossal reservoirs of rainwater. The Snake Queen locks the heavy iron gates behind her, confident that she had bought herself eternal safety. The walls of Ilal indeed seemed insurmountable to any earthly weapon, but Terken Khatun did not yet know that the sentence would be passed upon her not by a human. The sky itself would enter the matter. Winter of the year 1220. The collapsed empire of the Khwarazm Shahs is burning from the Sir Darya to the Caspian, but the Snake Queen still hopes to outplay fate. Having left the doomed Gurganj, Terken Khatun leads her court far to the south, into the inaccessible mountains of Mazandaran. A caravan stretching for kilometers drags a treasury into the rocks, capable of competing with the budget of all Western Europe of that time. Dozens of camels, bending under the weight of forged chests, carry gold, Indian pearls, and Chinese silk. Together with the matriarch ride her favorite younger grandsons and a huge harem. The goal of this exhausting march is Ilal, an impregnable stronghold soaring above the clouds. This mountain fortress represented a masterpiece of fortification. Carved into living rock, it had no vulnerable spots for siege engines. The main trump card of Ilal served as a unique system of stone cisterns that collected abundant rainfall. This region was traditionally famous for it. The defenders could hold the defense for years, experiencing absolutely no need for moisture. The walls that promised salvation became a cage. The gold intended to bribe enemies turned into useless metal. The ruler believed that the thickness of the masonry and tons of silver guaranteed her family's inviolability. In reality, these sheer cliffs turned into a gigantic, tightly sealed crypt. The riches of half the world, painfully raised to the summit, are now not worth a single sip of muddy water. Mongol Tumens come right up to the foot of Ilal. Assessing the scale of the obstacle, Genghis Khan's commanders refuse to throw men into a senseless frontal assault. They simply set up camp in the valley, encircling the mountain with a steel ring, and wait. From this moment, it is not military tactics that intervene in the course of history, but nature itself. Or, as the nomads believed, the eternal blue sky passes its personal sentence. Over the province of Mazandaran, famous for centuries for its humid climate, hangs a dead, dry silence. The sky above the fortress fades, becoming ruthlessly white. For the first time in many decades, not a single drop of rain falls here. Month after month, the scorching sun methodically drinks up the reserves of the reservoirs. The moisture level inexorably falls, exposing the cracked stone bottom. From the panorama of the besieged mountain, let us move into the stuffy chambers of Terken Khatun, saturated with animal fear. The princess, who decided the fates of Asian rulers, now sits motionless among open chests. Piles of golden dinars shimmer around her, and rubies sparkle. But her lips are covered with a bacon crust, and agonizing agony is read in the children's eyes. The ruler, locked in the rocks, realizes a terrifying truth. She was not betrayed by a man. God himself has turned away from her. No political genius and no treasures of the earth are capable of buying the mercy of the dried-up heavens. Spring of the year 1220. Broken by thirst and crushed psychologically, Terken Khatun gives her final order. The heavy iron gates of Ilal creak open. The mistress who dictated her will to kings slowly walks out to meet the conquerors, obediently holding out her hands for the blacksmith's shackles. She surrenders herself, her court, and the minor heirs of the once great throne to the mercy of the victor. The stronghold has fallen. The Snake Queen, shackled in chains, is still breathing. The loss of the crown, the empire, and freedom has not killed in her the hope for an honorable captivity. The aristocrat still believes that monarchs do not kill their equals. She assumes that Genghis Khan will treat her with the respect befitting an empress. The Lord of the East will indeed spare her life, but he will prepare a fate surpassing the horror of any physical torture. A quick death would have been too easy a deliverance for the one whose pride trampled the world. Instead of a scaffold, a feast awaits her. The long, grueling march across all of Eurasia ends in the very heart of the Great Steppe. The captives are delivered to Mongolia, to the headquarters of the Shaker of the Universe. The former mistress of the East, accustomed to the coolness of exquisite palace fountains and silk pillows, now batters her feet against the frozen earth of a foreign encampment. Even shackled in heavy irons, the Snake Queen clings desperately to the shards of her former pride. She sincerely believes that high status will protect her from the arbitrariness of the mob. The aristocrat assumes Genghis Khan, as a true monarch, will show respect to a ruler equal in blood, offering an honorable exile or a place among the wisest advisors. However, for the Lord of the Steppes, a defeated lineage holds no political value. The woman who for centuries demanded blind worship from sultans and emirs transforms overnight into a rightless object, whose fate is decided by a careless wave of a stranger's hand. Genghis Khan cold-bloodedly denies her a quick, noble death. The strike of a saber would have brought too merciful a deliverance for the one whose exorbitant ambitions ignited a world fire. Genghis Khan did not seek her blood, he thirsted for her humiliation. Before the gaze of the shocked Terken Khatun unfolds the final act of the destruction of her powerful line. Executioners roughly lead the minor heirs out onto the square, those very same favorite grandsons for whose advancement the Snake Queen sacrificed the empire and trampled the rights of Jalal al-Din. The boys are methodically executed one after another, right before the eyes of their grandmother, paralyzed with horror. The bloodline that the ruler tried so cruelly to keep on the throne is forever cut short in the dry dust of the camp. The physical extermination of the family serves only as a grim prelude to the main psychological ritual. Twilight thickens. In the huge tent, bonfires flare up brightly, announcing the beginning of the victory feast. The invaders drink strong wine, divide the looted booty, and praise the eternal blue sky. Into the center of this frenzied celebration, guards push an elderly woman clad in dirty rags. The Shaker of the Universe gives an order that astounds with its sophistication. He forces the former ruler of Khwarazm to serve the guests like a rightless slave. But simply bringing kumis to the victors proves insufficient. Genghis Khan commands Terken Khatun to loudly, aloud, mourn her own ruin, entertaining the Noyans during their meal. To the rhythmic sounds of lutes and the laughing of commanders, the woman who once dictated her will to kings begins a mournful song. She wails for the amusement of the crowd, listing the destroyed metropolises and murdered children, finally turning into a living jester. Every tear shed by her complements the feast as an exquisite seasoning, becoming yet another trophy of the invincible army. The person who arrogantly refused the help of her own heir for the sake of imaginary dignity now daily loses the remnants of her human semblance, howling in despair for the fleeting entertainment of the murderers of her family. The life of the Snake Queen ended ingloriously in the year 1233, amidst the ringing poverty and icy oblivion of Mongol exile. The fate of this woman left behind a terrifying historical paradox. For decades, Terken Khatun built a system of total control, turning Khwarazm into a personal fiefdom. She fought so selflessly for absolute power that in the end she destroyed the very basis of her might. Trying to save the throne from imaginary threats, the matriarch single-handedly collapsed the foundation of the state, cold-bloodedly sacrificing her family, the empire, and, ultimately, herself. This grim finale exposes a fundamental law. Internal egoism and the greed of elites always prove more destructive than any external enemy. The colossal Islamic power was not broken by the tactics of the Mongol cavalry at all. The country was burned out from the inside by blind maternal pride. One ghastly image is forever frozen in the memory of history. In the middle of the boundless snow-covered steppe stands a broken woman in dirty rags. Through the whistling of the wind, her endless funeral song for the empire is heard, an empire she herself once crushed in a greedy embrace. Khwarazm was swallowed by the abyss. Sultan Muhammad met an inglorious end on a Caspian island, and his mother disappeared into the depths of slavery. It seemed the Mongol steamroller had ground up everything living: Bukhara, Otrar, Samarkand. Horror paralyzed the will of entire nations, forcing them to obediently bow their heads. But in this man-made hell, there was one who refused to submit. A hero who proved that the elemental fury of the steppe avalanche could be tamed by cold engineering calculation. In the fourth episode of the cycle God's Anger, we will travel to the besieged city of Gurganj. You will meet the legendary Timur Melik. He turned an island citadel into an impregnable fort and created the first ironclads in history, ships protected by wet felt and clay. We will follow his desperate night breakthrough through Mongol ambushes, which marked the beginning of an exhausting guerrilla war. Subscribe to our channel to learn how a lone warrior challenged an invincible army and forever inscribed his name in eternity. See you soon.